Good morning, everyone. Well, at least it's morning for me. I don't know if it'll be morning for you if you're logging onto this recording at some other time, but good morning anyway. Um, this is Chapter 1, Lecture 2. This is all about the different schools of psychology and a bit more. We will talk about the schools of psychology related to whether they're rational or empirical, but we will also talk about the schools of psychology as far as just how to contrast them with each other. We will be discussing 4 of these schools of psychology more extensively in Chapter 11, which is our next chapter we're going to cover. So, here we go. Well, what is a school of psychology? Well, a school of psychology is a philosophical perspective of how to explain human behavior. That's what a school of psychology is. So, I've identified 8 for you in the study guide. There are many, many more, but these are generally the 8 that tend to be most used in psychology. Now, continuing on with the history, I talked a little bit about the 1870s previously, and Wilhelm Wundt, W-U-N-D-T. He was an Austrian psychologist, and he came up with a school of psychology. He called it structuralism. What is structuralism? It was an attempt to try to understand the structure of the human mind, the structure of the brain. What parts of the brain did what things from a psychological perspective. Wundt was a rabid empiricist. He was a researcher. He used a method of research that he called analytic introspection. Now, I know that sounds a little strange because when you think of the word introspect, you think of going within. And of course, that's a rationalistic concept. But in this case, his type of introspection was very, very simple. Before I move on any further, I think it's important that you understand that Wundt was referred to as the father of psychology. Why? Because he took the study of the human mind from a philosophical place and applied direct empirical research to the study of human behavior. By doing that, he took psychology out of the realm of philosophy and created a new science out of it, or a new branch of philosophy, in this case, psychology. Wundt studied sensation. Now, what is sensation? Well, there's sensation and then there's perception. Sensation is the reception of external stimuli by our sensory neurons in our body and bringing them into the body. If you think about it, the great majority of what we do on an everyday basis is sensation. We react to external stimuli in our world. You are all reacting to me as external stimuli from your world right now. It's making you think, hopefully. But it should be making you think. That whole process of stimulation is a constant thing that we receive from our world every day. And much of our behavior is simply reactions to external sensation. He did pieces of research such as he had analytic introspectors. These were subjects that he would pay to come participate in his research. It was simple stuff. And the introspection we're talking about here was only as extreme as an individual stating, I feel that sensation. Now, the sense he started to work with was the sense of touch, or the body senses. He wasn't working with vision or auditory sense or others. Instead, the sense of the body. So one of the things he did is he'd have them hold their hand out over the end of a table. And then off of the end of their finger, he'd hang this little receptacle. And then, while they weren't looking, of course, he would take a tiny little weight with a pair of tweezers, and he'd put that weight into the receptacle. And then he would simply wait for a moment to see if the individual felt the weight pulling on the receptacle. And if he didn't, he'd take the weight out, put it back, grab another slightly heavier and put it in, and would keep going up in weight until finally the person said, "Oh, I feel it." What he was trying to find was the lower thresholds of sensation. Another is that he took a two-pronged instrument, looked like a compass, like the one you'd measure distances on a map with. And he would touch the person's shoulder and ask them, with the 2 points close together, and ask them if they felt if they felt 1 or 2 points. Now, if it's on your shoulder and you touch there, the person's only going to feel 1 point, because we don't have very many nerve endings in the skin in our shoulder and back. Now, if they touched on the lips, that would be very different. There's tons and tons of nerve endings in our lips, for example. Then the person would probably be able to say 2, even though the 2 points were very close together. But on the shoulder, he would keep expanding and expanding and expanding until finally he'd touch and they'd say, "Oh, I feel 2 points." That would be the lowest threshold of that sensation on that portion of the body. So that's the kind of information he was trying to gather. It was pure empirical gathering of data. So we call him the father of psychology because he applied the scientific method to the study of human behavior. He was the first one. There was another psychologist in the United States who was a contemporary of Wundt, and that psychologist was William James. And you may have heard of William James in other classes before. He was very known as a philosopher. Started just a pinch later than Wundt, but created a contrary school of psychology to Wundt's. He called his school of psychology functionalism. Well, functionalism was much more concerned with the function of the human mind as opposed to its structure. How did it work as opposed to what parts do what things? And this is also a difference between rationalism and empiricism. As Wundt was an empiricist, James was more of a rationalist. Now, he did research, but he did a different kind of research, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute. James was a textbook writer. He wrote the first psychology textbook called Principles of Psychology. That textbook had 13 chapters. Your textbook has 15. 13 of the chapters in your textbook have the exact same names or titles as did James' first psychology textbook. So it hasn't, the study of psychology hasn't changed its course very much since William James in the late 1800s. He kind of structured the study of psychology with his first textbook. He did research, but he did a different type of research. His research is referred to as applied research, whereas Wundt's research is referred to as basic research. And you may have heard of these two terms in science classes. As I said, James was a rationalist. to write a textbook, you got to be a little bit more of a rationalist because you have to do a lot of theorizing. But I'm going to describe a different way of looking at rationalism and empiricism as it relates to these two schools of psychology. Consider that truth is the top of a pyramid. Truth's at the top. Well, applied research, or that of the rationalist, is referred to as top-down research, whereas the research of an empiricist is referred to as bottom-up research. Now, what do we mean here? Well, Wundt, the empiricist, started out with the idea of sensation, and he decided that he was going to gather as much data about the skin senses, the sense of touch, body senses, that he could possibly gather. And so he simply began to gather data, and he gathered and gathered and gathered and gathered until he gathered everything that he could at this first level. And if you're a true empiricist, you believe that that first level, once completely researched, will lead you to the next level. And then you start gathering at that level. And then once you've exhausted that level, it will take you to the next level, and you begin doing that research. Well, how long is bottom-up research going to take on its way up to truth? Well, it's going to take forever. That's one of the downsides of empirical-based basic research. This is the basic research the empiricist does. It takes forever, but it's incredibly intricate and complete. The empiricist always perceives himself as accurate because they have all the data. But it takes forever to get up to that truth. On the other hand, the rationalist believes in applied research. Applied research means you start with an hypothesis. Well, the moment you start with an hypothesis, you're a little less empirical because it's a theory. It's not just observation. It's an idea that comes from your head. And so you believe you know what the truth is already. And then you start doing research on the way down, gathering data. Now, if you think you know the truth of something, are you going to be a bit biased in your observation of data? Well, of course you are. Because you already believe you know what the truth is up here, even though you may not. So applied research can get us to an answer a whole lot quicker, but it's not as accurate. And so it depends on what you're looking for. If we were trying to find a cure for breast cancer, we'd go with applied research because people are doing basic research, empirically based basic research right now in think tanks to try to get up to this truth. Whereas people who have studied immunology have different ideas of how they believe cancer could be addressed in this way. They both have their benefits, they both have their weaknesses, but they're both good types of research. The top-down, rational, applied research, the bottom-up, basic, empirical research. So those are the differences, some of the differences also between functionalism and structuralism. Now, I'll let you know that functionalism and structuralism, they're done. Structuralism had too narrow a focus, and so it petered out after about 30 years, maybe a little more. Functionalism was a reaction to structuralism. Of course, if structuralism petered out and functionalism was a reaction to structuralism, well, it petered out too. So they were no longer useful. Oh, excuse me. They were no longer useful, functional types of schools of psychology any longer. But what they did do is they gave birth to all the rest of the schools of psychology. And for that, we call them major schools of psychology because they were right there at the beginning. Now, the next school of psychology is one that most of you would consider as being the most likely to be the original school, and that is psychoanalysis, started by Sigmund Freud. So, it's the oldest school of psychology that is still in use. And people criticize Freud's psychoanalysis, but interestingly, even though they criticize Freud's psychoanalysis, whenever somebody comes up with a new school of psychology, the first thing they try to do is disprove Freud's psychoanalysis. And sadly, they really can't completely disprove it. And so even if somebody disagrees with it, they're still giving it credence by trying to disprove it. Psychoanalysis started by Sigmund Freud. He eventually, over time, and this started in the late 1800s, in the 1890s, is when he first became a psychiatrist, and he started studying the unconscious mind. Slowly over time, he created a very extensive school of psychology that explains human behavior in its way. And how is that? Well, for Freud, he believed in three basic principles. Number one was the existence of an unconscious mind. Now, was Freud the first person to research the unconscious mind? Well, of course not. There were lots of people prior to him who considered that there was an unconscious mind and were trying to tap into that unconscious mind. Freud, though, was the first individual who gave the unconscious mind a structure. And that structure was the id, the ego, and the superego. Now, we're not going to talk about those extensively right now. Just understand they are structures that make up the unconscious mind, according to Sigmund Freud. He's the first one who gave it structure. Therefore, he seems to be the one who's really credited with better insight into what the unconscious mind is. The second premise of psychoanalysis is what Freud calls his stages of psychosexual development. Now, this is where the word sex comes into psychoanalysis. And everybody who only knows very little about psychoanalysis thinks Freud was some kind of pervert. And he wasn't. He simply did something to get people's attention. Remember, Freud was around in what was called the Victorian era, Queen Victoria, a very prudish era. Nobody even said the word sex, nonetheless talked it and discussed it. And what did he do? Well, the first thing he did is he said that all human beings have sexual urges and drives, even newborn infants, except his definition of the word sex really was a continuum of affectionate behavior. For him, affectionate behavior existed from the little suckling infant to the other end of the continuum, which is erotic sexual interaction between individuals. Well, those are extreme differences, but all of them are considered to be on the continuum of affectionate behavior. And so Freud, instead of saying affectionate behavior, and this is in his own writings, instead said, we're just going to use the symbolic word sex. And by golly, did he get everybody's attention? Just like now, you say the word sex and you get everybody's attention. Well, he got everybody's attention then, and they listened to what he had to say. And he came up with 5 stages of psychosexual development. His was really the first organized developmental theory of any of the many developmental theories that we'll cover in Chapter 10. So we will, again, in Chapter 11, discuss those stages of psychosexual development more extensively. The third concept of psychoanalysis, so remember the first, the unconscious mind and its structure. Second, stages of psychosexual development. And third, defense mechanisms. These are unconscious processes that Freud says we use to keep certain information in our unconscious mind that our unconscious mind doesn't believe our conscious mind is capable of dealing with at that point in time. So, that's, in very, very simple terms, psychoanalysis. Now, when you look at psychoanalysis, everything is internal. It is a very rational theory. Extremely rational. Okay? Now, in the early 1900s, along came Ivan Pavlov, and then about 10 years later, B.F. Skinner, who we're going to learn a whole bunch about in Chapter 6. Their school of psychology is behaviorism. Behaviorism is exceptionally empirical, because behaviorism is based on 2 basic premises. Number 1, observation. Observable behavior. We only trust behavior we can observe. We don't trust anything else. Only behavior we can observe. That being the case, you could believe that there's an unconscious mind, but if you can't see it, you can't trust it. Therefore, it is not considered something usable in behaviorism. So you're trusting the behavior that is observable, that's external. Secondly, the second premise is that the environment impinging upon us is what causes our behavioral patterns. So the punishments and the reinforcements that our environment gives us is what creates us into the person we become. Again, that is an external variable putting force onto the individual. Okay? Very different than psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is saying all of this unconscious stuff inside of us is causing all of our behavior out here. Whereas behaviorism is saying the external world causes who we become. So as you can see, behaviorism is very empirical. Now, that being the case, with behaviorism being empirical, we also have to take a look at another theory, another ism. So not a school of psychology, but a philosophy. And that philosophy is determinism. Determinism means that this is a theory that suggests something other than our free will causes our behavior. Now, both psychoanalysis and behaviorism are theories that are deterministic. In psychoanalysis, it says that your unconscious processes deep inside of you, which your conscious mind is not aware of, are causing your behavior. And you have much less than free will control over that. Behaviorism is saying that it's external forces way outside of you that are causing you to become whom you become. These are both very deterministic theories. Now, the next theory we're going to discuss, and we're going to go a little bit out of chronological order, and this is humanism. Actually, Gestalt psychology would be the next one chronologically. But when we talk about the big three in psychology, we're talking about the big three schools of psychology. And they are psychoanalysis, behaviorism, and humanism. So that's why I'm going to talk about humanism now. Humanism wasn't around until the late 40s, early 50s. There are three names I want you to be familiar with. And again, in psychoanalysis, Jung and Adler, we will discuss more in chapter 11. Carl Rogers, Abraham Maslow, and Viktor Frankl are all humanists that I want you to be familiar with, and we'll talk about each of them more in chapter 11. Humanism has two basic principles. Number one, humanism believes that the core of every human being is a core of goodness. Now, this means that you believe that the worst human being you've ever encountered or known about actually has a core of goodness deep inside of them. They just need to find it. Now, if you believe that, you could be a humanist. But if you question that and say, I don't know, that one person I know, I don't think that one person has any core of goodness. Well, you have to believe that if you're a humanist. And the second principle of humanism makes it a non-deterministic theory. The second principle of humanism is free will, that we have choice. Humanism is an offshoot of the existentialism of the early to mid-1800s in the United States, with the philosophers like Henry David Thoreau, suggesting that we have free will. Thoreau, in his book, Walden, said, man is the captain of his own ship and the master of his own destiny. Now, we all like that idea. We like to believe that we have choice. And that's all a fine and dandy idea. But you really have to believe it all the way. Rogers, Maslow, and Frankl all have differing theories. Frankl's theory we won't go into too much, but we will talk about him some, especially as it relates to the concepts of choice and free will. Now, Frankl is the author of the book that you can read to get extra credit. Rogers and Maslow were practicing psychologists who came up with different ways of trying to address how people can gain choice and find their free will and make themselves more free. That's the basic of humanism. And as you can tell, humanism is about going within yourself and finding that self. And the self is a very important concept in humanism. Finding that self deep, deep inside of you. There's also the concept of congruence and incongruence. In psychoanalysis, it's unconscious drives that cause our behavior. In behaviorism, it's external influences that cause our behavior. In humanism, it is a feeling of incongruence. Most humanists, most psychologists believe that there are three basic parts to us. Our cognitive part, the way we think, our emotional part, the way we feel, and our behavioral part, the way we act. Now, how often are those three parts incongruent? I would suggest very often in our lives. This morning when you woke up, when that alarm went off, your cognitive self said, I got to get out of bed, dang it. Your behavioral self just started to roll because it followed your cognition. But was your emotional self going along with the other two in that moment? No, it was probably screaming, no! Well, that's incongruence. And when those three parts of us don't all fit together just nice and pretty, then we have a feeling of incongruence. And that incongruence is what motivates us to do something different. And according to the humanist, that trying to resolve that incongruence will get us closer and closer and closer to the internal self. All of this stuff is happening inside of you. Ergo, a very rational theory, humanism, and a non-deterministic theory, which is different than psychoanalysis and behaviorism. So some theories can be the same as far as rational or empirical leanings, but that doesn't mean that their determinism and non-determinism are so connected. Okay, now we'll step back chronologically to Gestalt psychology. The word Gestalt, it started in Germany, and Wertheimer, who is the professor, and Kafka and Kohler, who were his two graduate students, were the founders of Gestalt psychology. They started in the early 1930s. They were very lucky to get out of Germany before Hitler closed it down. And they eventually made it to the United States. And because of that, their theory continued. Hitler wouldn't have liked their theory very much. And one of them, I believe, was Jewish, which would have been, of course, much worse. The word Gestalt in German means wholeness and organization. Now, this theory is a very perceptual theory. It's about perceptions. And there are two major premises. Number one, the whole, W-H-O-L-E, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And the second principle is called figure-ground relationships. So what do we mean by this? Well, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Everybody watches TV shows and movies every day. Well, the whole production that you see is a combination of a whole bunch of separate variables. And all those separate variables come together to create something. And what they end up creating is more than the sum of their parts. Just adding up the different parts. So, recognize, first of all, Gestalt psychology started with Wertheimer, Kafka, and Kohler researching something called the phi phenomenon, PHI phenomenon. The phi phenomenon is the illusion of movement when no movement is actually occurring. And that's what a movie is. A movie is numerous still pictures presented in rapid succession, projected, focused, sound attached to it, and a whole bunch of other things attached, is what ultimately makes that movie. Well, let's consider the making of that movie for a little bit. The whole movie, meaning the interactions of all the different variables together, coming together, creates something much grander than simply sound, picture, projection added together. It becomes almost exponential in what it becomes as something greater than simply the variables in an additive fashion. So that's what we mean by the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. We see that in relationships too. In many relationships, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Okay. The second premise of Gestalt psychology is the idea of figure-ground relationships. So I'm going to do the extent of my drawing here, which isn't very extensive. I'm going to draw y'all a cube. Okay? It's a cube. A badly drawn cube, but hey. Now, if you look at this cube just the right way, it will switch back and forth on you. It's very interesting. But why? Well, you can stare at two different places. You can either stare right here, Or you can stare. Now I gotta look at it myself. Or you can stare right here. Okay? Now, if you stare right here long enough, what will happen is this square will stick out to you as the front portion of the cube. This will be the top of the cube, and it will be kind of facing down in this direction. But if you stare right here long enough, all of a sudden this pops out as the front of the cube. And it's pointing up in this direction. And this would be the bottom of the cube. And if you stare at it long enough, you'll see this will switch back and forth on you. Why? Because of figure-ground relationships. Because honestly, if you're staring right here, and this is the front of the cube and it's pointing down in this direction, this point of the actual cube, if it was real, would physically be closest to you. Therefore, the figure. And everything else becomes the ground or the background. If you stare here, and this one's sticking out, and it's pointing up in that direction, with this being the bottom, if it was a box, this angle, this point of the box, would physically be the closest point of the box to you. Again, the figure, and the rest is the ground. Now, this is just a visual example, and a visual example, there's not much to that. But the visual example exemplifies the psychological concept. And what do we mean by exemplifying that psychological concept? We mean that this happens in relationships and it happens in everyday life. Things stand out to us. They're the figure. The ground is everything else that gives it contrast. If you have a favorite painting, then you've experienced figure-ground relationships because certain things in those paintings are more important to you than other aspects of the painting. Those that stand out to you are the figure. Those that give those figures contrast are the ground. Favorite painting of mine is one by Velázquez, a Spanish artist. And he's standing back and holding his little palette, and you see the back of the easel, and he's looking studiously outward, and outward you see the king standing there. And the king's in this bright outfit, but to the side of him and kind of back, there's a full-length mirror, and you see the king in the full-length mirror. Everything about the painting draws you to that mirror, and you end up inspecting the king. Now, the king was actually a doofus. He was a bad king and kind of a dumb one. But Velázquez made him look really good in that mirror. It was bright. In addition to that, there were lines that converged on the mirror from all over the room. And so it made the mirror the center of everything, the figure, with everything else giving it ground. Now, the sad thing is the king saw it and got all mad because he wanted the painting to just be him. So Velázquez painted him again. This time he made the king look like the king looked, and the king looked like a doofus in the second painting. But apparently the king liked that one. Figure-ground relationships function in our lives every day. When we first meet somebody and we fall in love, well, we see certain figures that stand out to us. Their beautiful eyes and all that cool stuff. But a couple of years into it, where they squeeze the toothpaste tube from sometimes becomes the figure. Things change over time. Figure-ground relationships change. So in Gestalt psychology, the whole idea is to try to shake up the system, to force you to see other potential figures and grounds and change around our view of things. And that's what a Gestalt therapist will do. There are two schools of psychology left. We're going to spend about 5 minutes on each one. Now, Gestalt psychology. Gestalt psychology is the perfect example of a perfect balance between rationalism and empiricism. So if I were to ask you on a test, is Gestalt psychology rational or empirical? You would say yes, because it's got internal stuff, all of that internal processing, but it also has a lot of external data. So it's really a great combination of the two. Now, next is cognitive psychology. The term cognitive, if you know what it means, tells you that cognitive psychology is a rational theory, because the word cognitive has everything to do with thought. And thought is the basis of rationalism. Cognitive psychology is anything that has to do with our cognitive processes. What are our cognitive processes? Attention, concentration, memory, reasoning, judgment, abstract thought, etc. All of these processes are cognitive processes. Cognitive psychology believes that both our emotions and our behavior are consequences of our beliefs. Our beliefs, the cognitive part of us, contributes to both behavior and emotion. And so in order to change a person's emotion and behavior, you must change their beliefs. How many of us have false beliefs about ourselves? Well, I would venture to say that every one of us has false beliefs about ourselves. We tell lies about ourselves. The other day I went down to the garage to the tool wall to get a tool for a job I was trying to do. And I stood there in front of the tool wall and I looked at it and I had nothing. I could not remember what tool it was that I was trying to come down and get. And I just sat there and looked, thinking if I looked long enough, I'll remember what it is, and I didn't. And I whispered to myself, "Oh, Fielding, you idiot. I know I'm not an idiot. I got a frickin' PhD. I know I'm not an idiot." But in that moment, I believed I was an idiot because I couldn't find a stupid tool. Well, all of us have those kinds of beliefs that we carry around in our heads, most of them from childhood. And in cognitive psychology, the idea is to find those beliefs, confront them with truth and change them, and consequently, both our behavior and our emotion will change also. So if someone believes that they're a horrible human being and they're very depressed, if we can help them realize they're not a horrible human being, then it will bring down the level of their depression because that old belief is contributing to that concept. This is cognitive psychology. We're going to talk about Jean Piaget. We're going to talk about Albert Ellis, Aaron Beck. These are all well-known cognitive psychologists who have come up with amazing treatment methodologies. Many of you have heard of cognitive behavioral theory or therapy. This is one of them, and it's really a very, very good theory. So cognitive, very, very rational, because it's all about going within, finding the false beliefs, and changing them. Now, the last school of psychology we're going to cover is biological psychology. Now, biological psychology, the concept is extremely simple. But just because the concept is extremely simple doesn't make it a simple theory. It's a very complex theory. But the idea is our genetics make up who we are. We are born with who we become. Now, people don't like this because it's a very deterministic theory, right? Whereas cognitive theory is a little less deterministic because we believe we can change those beliefs, right? But biological theory, can you change your DNA? Well, right now we can't change our DNA. Maybe in the next little while with research, we'll be able to learn how to change our DNA. I don't know, we'll see. But Eysenck and Chomsky are two of the major focuses of biological theory. And again, I'll explain them a little bit more in chapter 11. Let me give you an example. You probably know someone who has an extra half a chromosome attached to either the 13th or the 23rd pair of chromosomes. Well, if that person has an extra half a chromosome attached, they suffer from Down syndrome. Now, we would love to be able to apply humanism to this individual with Down syndrome. But no matter how hard that person with Down syndrome tries, will they ever be able to get to the point that they can go to college and function in a college setting? Well, the grand majority of them will never be able to do that because they don't have the cognitive functional capacity to be able to do it. That doesn't mean they're not a good person and someone that we love and care about. It just means they're not going to be able to do certain things. So all the choice in the world, all the free will in the world is not going to change certain things about us. I loved basketball when I was younger. 5'10", good point guard, but no matter how hard I tried, I was never going to be able to be a successful center because my DNA determined where I played on that basketball court. So, those are your schools of psychology. And biological theory, rational or empirical? Well, it's biological. You got physical stuff that you're researching. This is very empirical. You can touch it. It's physical. Okay? So a very empirical theory. Now, the last thing I want to talk to you about is the fields of psychology, just very rapidly. Fields of psychology are different than schools of psychology. Schools of psychology are philosophical perspectives that cause human behavior. A field of psychology is nothing more than the task a psychologist does, their job. I'm a clinical psychologist. I diagnose and treat mental disorders. That's what a clinical psychologist does. An experimental psychologist is a psychologist who simply does research. They don't practice psychology. They don't do assessment and treatment of psychological disorders. They simply set up psychological studies. That's who I would consult with if I wanted to do a study. Educational psychologists assess problems in learning and then come up with plans to try to address that learning. So, for example, learning disabilities, ADHD, etc. By the way, did you know that people with learning disabilities on average have higher IQ than the general population? So don't make fun of people with learning disabilities because they're probably smarter than you. Educational psychologists determine what the problem is in the processing of information, and then they come up with a plan to assist that person to overcome that disability in processing. So that's what an educational psychologist does. A social psychologist studies group dynamics as it affects individual behavior. Some of you have done studied sociology. Sociology simply measures the dynamics of group behavior. Well, social psychology studies how group dynamics affect individual behavior. So it's a little different, somewhat like sociology, but a little different. Industrial psychology. This is where psychologists are trying to figure out how to make industry do better. So they come up with different tests to determine which people would be best in which settings of employment. Or number two, they try to make workers happy. And with the idea that a happy worker is a productive worker. That's what an industrial psychologist does. Developmental psychologists, they study change from conception to death. So as soon as that zygote is created from the sperm and the ovum, they start measuring that developmental process all the way until death. So developmental psychology comes up with numerous different types of psychology. Numerous different types of developmental theories in psychology. So that's what fields of psychology are, or as your book talks about them, specialties in psychology. So that's the end of today's lecture, and we'll see you next week with a new lecture.